welcome to a new episode of the EpiNutrition Podcast. Do you feel like you have little energy? You are not managing to lose weight, you are aging faster than you'd like. That is exactly why you should listen to today's packed episode about mitochondria, which are most likely behind the loss of energy. These microscopic organelles decide many things, such as how much strength you have, how your body manages stress, regeneration, and even physical performance. And as you'll learn today, they influence your vitality and the pace at which you age. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Mitochondria are in constant dialogue with your DNA, and epigenetics is the language they use to speak to each other. Hi, Blani.
Hi.
We've gotten to the long-promised podcast about mitochondria.
Again today, you were surprised that we hadn't recorded it yet.
It seemed to me that I've talked about mitochondria here so many times that it must have been in the form of a separate podcast at some point. But if you say so, then I guess not. And yet mitochondria and how red light affects them and what starts them up and turns them off. That is something that is consulted or debated a lot in the circles of biohackers and health enthusiasts. So let's entice our listeners to today's episode. Is the relationship between dysfunctional mitochondria and premature aging really that crucial?
It is probably very crucial. It is hard to say how big of a role it plays because there are more factors that influence aging. It is not just mitochondria, but it is simply epigenetic changes, mainly gene methylation. It is simply the rate of cellular senescence. It is problems with autophagy, which can also be related to mitochondria. But basically, it is true that with age, the number of mitochondria decreases and their function worsens. So it is kind of a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, but the relationship is definitely there and it is quite strong.
That should be enough to entice our friends, biohackers, and health enthusiasts for today's.
Definitely, functional mitochondria are a prerequisite for us to age more slowly.
Agreed.
But it is one of the conditions, but definitely a very crucial one.
Great, friends! The promised episode about mitochondria is here. Prepare for a load of knowledge that will help you start your engine at the cellular level. Answering my questions will be Blanka Pekov-Kolovov, a lady who has been studying epigenetics for years. Published the first book on epigenetics in the Czech language. The second will be on the shelves soon, and she runs the first epigenetic counseling center and is also the editor-in-chief of Hranu magazine. Mitochondria have recently become a pretty popular topic in the world of health and biohacking, which is why we're here today to also look at them from the perspective of epigenetics. So let's start lightly. What are mitochondria? Where do we find them? And what is their basic function?
We find them in cells, inside cells, and the main function is to produce energy. Basically, they are sometimes called cellular power plants. If we're talking about animals, they are dependent on actually getting their energy from food. Plants don't. They, of course, need water and some nutrients and carbon dioxide, but they don't use it to create energy, but receive energy from the sunday. So if you look at it that way, if we're talking about those power plants, a plant is de facto a kind of solar power plant. An animal cell is a power plant that burns something. Let's say a thermal power plant. Kind of like that. But not literally, heat is also generated there, but it is not used to convert into mechanical work, to be physically precise. But it is basically a power plant that burns either sugars or fats. You see, our cells can't create these nutrients, utilize them directly. They first have to convert them into so-called macroergic phosphates or not convert. That would be chemically inaccurate of me. There is no conversion of those nutrients into ATP or CP. but the energy from them is stored in so-called macroergic bonds, which are high energy bonds that are found in those macroergic phosphates. So de facto, ATP could be compared to a kind of battery storage, that the energy that the mitochondrion as a power plant produces can be partly used directly and partly stored in that battery storage in the form of those macroergic phosphates. The capacity of that storage is not very high, but in a way it partly works like that. The energy we have, for example, if we're talking about sports, the energy from the ATP and CP that we have in those muscles is enough for 20 to 30 seconds of maximum exertion, depending on the training. So an average person can run 100 on it, a trained sprinter, a 200, for example.
Meters.
Of course.
Yeah, we used to draw cells in elementary and high school. In the cells, there was a nucleus. There were some of those chloroplasts.
Those are in plant cells.
Right. Okay. That is where the chlorophyll is, which converts sunlight into energy. Right? They were green, and we drew the mitochondria in red. They were about the same size, as I vaguely recall now from my notebook. For instance, the mitochondria in that one animal cell, how many are there?
Well, basically it can be tens to hundreds. More like tens.
Then there is the Golgi complex, the nucleus. What else do we have in there?
Ribosomes. Those are important. That is where proteins are actually made.
Or?
Transcription. Well, part of it happens in the ribosomes.
And what else do we have in those cells? Cytoplasm, cell wall. There is probably something else.
Endoplasmic reticulum.
Yes, something else is floating around in there. Exactly, good. That was a little test to see if Blanca knows her stuff. And of course she does. So now things are going to get a little more complicated. As I said, most of us probably remember that our DNA is stored in the cell nucleus. But apparently, mitochondria have their own DNA. Could you explain to me how that works?
Yes, mitochondria have their own DNA, and the reason they have it is quite interesting. According to what are probably the most common theories, mitochondria were originally separate organisms. Separate single-celled organisms that had acquired the ability to convert nutrients into macroergic phosphates. And the other cells from which the so-called eukaryotic cells then arose actually kind of engulfed the mitochondria, but instead of eating them, digesting them, they made them their own little slaves, who produced that energy for them. So mitochondria were originally separate organisms, and that is why they have their own DNA.
Thank you. What is, or rather, is the DNA in the cell nucleus exactly the same as the DNA in the mitochondria?
In terms of the chemical structure of the DNA itself, then basically yes. But there are some pretty fundamental differences. Basically, every cell has 46 de facto DNA molecules in its nucleus. Because each chromosome, and we have in each cell, except for egg and sperm cells, we have 46 chromosomes in each cell, 23 pairs, and actually the chromosome is a single molecule of DNA which is wound around little balls of protein called histones. And those histones are quite important because, for one, they participate in some of the epigenetic reactions that take place within the DNA and turn individual genes off and on. And they also have an important stabilizing function. So that X, that familiar X, what we picture when we say chromosome, that is a single, rather long molecule of DNA wrapped around those histones together. It is called chromatin, that mixture of histones and DNA. So every cell has in its nucleus, except for eggs and sperm, it actually has 46 molecules of DNA in its nucleus. In contrast, mitochondria, they usually have something like 2 to 10 molecules inside them. So there can actually be tens to hundreds in each cell, depending on how many mitochondria there are. So there can basically be more of them than the nuclear ones, the molecules, but they are significantly shorter, like really, really significantly, 1,000 to 10,000 times shorter. And what is also important, they don't have those histones.
I see. And what I am also interested in, and I am drawing a little from your article now, because it struck me that mitochondrial DNA is often like mutated, or it is full of mutations.
That is precisely a consequence of the absence of histones, because the histones, as I said, have a certain stabilizing and protective function. So since the histones aren't there, the DNA in the mitochondria is much, much more susceptible to various influences that can damage it, whether it is free radicals directly in the mitochondria or some external influences, radiation, and so on. So all these influences that have the potential to also damage the nuclear DNA, the mitochondrial one is much more sensitive to their effects.
And is a mutation always bad, or can it also be good?
Well, a mutation is bad in most cases, but sometimes a good one appears, which is then passed on in evolution, you know. So it doesn't have to be necessarily bad, but the probability that it will be bad is much higher than that it will be good.
Okay, are these mutations reversible?
Or are they absolutely irreversible? No, mutations are irreversible. Unlike epigenetic changes, which are largely reversible, mutations are irreversible.
Okay.
Like, of course, the body has certain repair mechanisms that can simply repair the DNA, but the capacity, their capacity is very limited.
Okay, let's move on slowly, because I am a bit slower in these things. I have to picture it well to understand it. When the DNA in those mitochondria is mutated, is there some kind of mechanism where it just liquidates itself, or what happens to the mutated DNAs?
Well, generally, a cell has repair mechanisms by which it can eliminate the damaged organelles. This mechanism is called autophagy. It is basically a mechanism by which a cell eats itself, which sounds kind of scary, but it is basically a good process, because firstly, it is a process that allows us to survive in moments of hunger, when we don't have a food supply for some time, on the order of several days, not hours, of course.
Right.
So by the fact that the cell starts to eat some of its own components, it gains energy for its functioning. And secondly, which is more important in our civilized world, autophagy is what eliminates the damaged organelles, including, for example, damaged mitochondria, which is very important. Because the moment the mitochondria are damaged, not only do they not work well, but they are basically actively causing harm, because they start to produce free radicals and also produce substances that bind to the receptors of immune cells. And the moment they do that, the immune cells behave the same way as in contact with a pathogen, meaning they start to produce inflammatory cytokines. So when the mitochondria are damaged, not only does the cell not produce energy as it should, so the respective tissue suffers from a lack of energy, but on top of that, an inflammatory process develops there, which causes further health problems and accelerates aging.
Right. We just don't want that. And just to comment on those free radicals, it was about 2 episodes ago when you explained that a free radical is an electron that is missing a partner, and because it is angry, it just kicks around and rips out partners from other things that are in the body. I don't know, from the cell wall and so on. And to be chemically precise.
So it is not a free electron, but it is a molecule that has an unpaired electron in it. Super.
Thank you, because I am a little different with chemistry and all that. But you basically presented it well, because you explained it beautifully. Simply, the poor little lonely electron is so lonely that it becomes aggressive. So, and we don't want those free radicals, A and D. Okay, so now we've described what a molecule is, where to find it, what its function is, and what happens when the mitochondrion is damaged. And I just realized I might have said molecule at the beginning of my speech, but I meant mitochondria.
You did, but I think everyone understood.
So at least I did hear, yes. So we know what we've said. And so let's look further at the connection between mitochondria and aging. And you may have already mentioned this, whether it is the chicken or the egg. Because are we aging because mitochondria don't work? Or do mitochondria not work because we are already aging?
Probably both. With age, the function of mitochondria and the number of mitochondria in individual tissues deteriorates. And at the same time, the dysfunctional mitochondria and the insufficient number of mitochondria significantly accelerate aging because they impair tissue function. That is basically the basis that the mitochondrion produces energy. And all the cells in the body need energy to function. All the tissues in the body need energy. So the moment you have too few mitochondria or they don't work well, you have a lack of energy in that particular tissue. And when a tissue lacks energy, it simply suffers, withers, and ages. So in fact, a large number of different diseases have mitochondrial dysfunction in their origins, as does aging.
Well, to name one, for example, what people usually associate with aging and disease is Alzheimer's. But people who are under a lot of stress can also get it. They just suddenly get Alzheimer's at 40. It is reversible. We even have this experience. Diabetes, heart disease.
There, it is actually important in the sense that mitochondria are more important, of course, for all tissues and cells in the body. But there are certain tissues that are more energy demanding than others, and they suffer more from mitochondrial dysfunction than others. So the biggest energy consumer is, of course, the brain. So basically, you could say that all problems that are in some way related to the brain are accompanied by mitochondrial dysfunction, whether it is the aforementioned Alzheimer's, but it is also ADHD, autism, depression. All these problems include, among other things, mitochondrial dysfunction. The heart needs a huge amount of energy for its work, the liver, the kidneys. So these are the kinds of organs that also suffer the most if the mitochondria in them don't work well.
And in the article, you also mentioned that mitochondrial dysfunction is even related to hair loss.
Basically anything can be related, basically any tissue can be dysfunctional the moment the mitochondria in it don't work well. Yeah, so it can be not only hair loss but also the condition of the skin. Of course, physical activity, athletic performance, right? It is absolutely key there, because if the mitochondria in the muscles don't produce enough energy, then the muscle can't perform the mechanical work because it doesn't have enough energy for it. So for athletic performance, mitochondria are absolutely key.
You brought up athletic performance. That is something I am always interested in. Professional athletes, but also hobbyists who try really hard. Always focus on having enough of everything in their blood. Iron, oxygen, and all those bindings and everything. So is it as important for them, or how important is it to focus on mitochondria versus, say, focusing on having high altitude training before an important race? Can that be compared at all?
Well, that high altitude training is part of a certain tuning, let's say. That its purpose is you've already trained something and now you need to maximize it, because the principle of high altitude training is that you put the body into an oxygen deficit de facto, because at those high altitudes the so-called partial pressure of oxygen is lower. So basically anyone who has ever experienced it, tried to run at a high altitude, knows that it is crazy. So you are actually kind of suffocating the body a little, and it reacts by learning to work better with that oxygen. That means it primarily multiplies red blood cells.
So what about the mitochondria now?
Well, the mitochondria are actually... You have to work on the mitochondria all the time.
I see.
And it is also important to say that they aren't equally important for all sports. If you are a shot putter, you don't really need mitochondria for the performance itself, because you need to exert a huge amount of muscle force in a short moment. And there you just make do with the energy reserves that are in the muscle. when you run a 100-meter dash, you also don't need very functional mitochondria because, again, you make do with the stores of that ATP-CP that are currently present in the muscle. And how quickly it replenishes afterwards, you basically don't care because you are already done running. But the moment the energy for that performance from the ATP and CP you have in your muscles is no longer enough, that is when you need to have the mitochondria functional in some way. That means for everything from about those 30 seconds on, you need functional mitochondria. Because you need to continuously replenish the ATP, the macroergic phosphates that you actually consume during the performance. You need to continuously replenish them. That means that your muscle cells, their mitochondria, have to work at maximum because they're constantly decreasing. Basically, the battery is constantly running down and you need to recharge it. And you have to do it again and again and again and efficiently. Because if you don't do it efficiently, you have to slow down because you don't produce enough energy to be able to run fast.
Okay, thank you for explaining that to me. Blanca and I are always discussing epigenetics here and how important it is to turn on the right genes. But you know what? You don't have to be alone in this. There is Epigemic, an e-shop that is loaded with only products based on the principles of epigenetics. You'll find dietary supplements and functional foods there that will help you fully utilize your body's potential. No unnecessary stuff, just what makes sense and has a scientific basis. Check out Epigemic, CZ, and choose what your body needs right now. Your DNA will thank you. In the article on Epinutrition about mitochondria, you mentioned that mitochondria are extremely sensitive to oxidative stress. That is, the free radicals we've already talked about. I'd still like to ask, why is that?
Well, during those processes, the energy production, when it is burning, in quotes, the nutrients, the oxygen, the sugar, and the fat, that is when a lot of free radicals are created, which have to be neutralized there. That means you need to have enough antioxidants directly in the mitochondria to continuously eliminate those free radicals. But the slight problem is that not all antioxidants can get in there very well.
Well, I wanted to ask if it is a good choice to just eat more antioxidants in general.
In general, it is important to eat those antioxidants, but perhaps even more important is to support the production of your own internal antioxidants. And in the case of mitochondria, this is specifically glutathione. It is actually a hormone that has strong antioxidant effects. It is one of the most important internal antioxidants, and it works particularly effectively inside the mitochondria. So the amount of glutathione, among other things, is key there.
Okay, and how do I increase this internal antioxidant?
Well, first of all, you need to have enough of its building blocks, which are amino acids, specifically cysteine and glycine.
And can you supplement that, or?
Of course, you have to make sure you have enough essential amino acids in your diet. Cysteine is a sulfur containing amino acid, so it is important to have enough sulfur. Those sulfur amino acids are found a lot in eggs, for example, and a source of sulfur is also cruciferous vegetables.
Got it, so thank you. And I'd also like to ask, because I also read that in your article.
Let me interrupt you.
Yes.
Dietary supplements can very effectively support the production of glutathione. Firstly, selenium, and secondly, astaxanthin.
Great. That is quite important. A lot of athletes use astaxanthin. I don't know, even though I am not an extreme athlete, but I use it mainly in the summer to get a good tan. On Boris's advice, I've mentioned that many times here before. But I also read in your article that the fight against those free radicals could be supported by synthetic antioxidants. Specifically plastoquinone, which is called the molecular locomotive. So could you explain that to our listeners?
Plastoquinone is simply a substance that is able to transport those antioxidants through the mitochondrial membrane into the mitochondrion. It is speculated that plastoquinone, in combination with some vitamin E or some antioxidants, that Putin supposedly uses it. But that is more like gossip, you know.
Right.
But in any case, in the Russian-speaking academic environment, plastoquinone is studied quite extensively.
No leaks for us to get smart here. Okay. I am also wondering if mitochondria might have a connection, but I already assume they do. With the microbiome, and how do mitochondria affect the microbiome's health?
Mainly, there is the connection of mitochondrial function with the state of the gut microbiome, because if the microbiome is balanced, it produces enough short-chain fatty acids, which are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And butyrate in particular is extremely important for the mitochondria because it even has positive epigenetic effects on mitochondrial DNA and actually supports energy production processes.
Great, that butyrate, that is pretty good stuff. It is a shame that when an ordinary person wants to buy it, there is no health claim. And if they don't listen to our podcast, they probably won't hear about it.
Well, taking butyrate as a supplement can have pitfalls because I've mentioned in podcasts many times that I don't recommend long-term use of something the body should produce itself.
Right. It is like with melatonin.
So a much more effective way to get enough butyrate is to support the gut microbiome's balance in order to multiply the bacteria there that produce that butyrate. Of course, if a person has some problems, it makes sense to take butyrate, because there is a two-way relationship, so to speak, with the state of the gut microbiome. Because butyrate maintains the integrity of the intestinal barrier. And if your intestinal barrier integrity is compromised, that in turn reflects on the gut microbiome's balance. So you have too few good bacteria, so you have poor intestinal wall integrity, and that in turn kills off the good bacteria. So when you have a problem where butyrate can sort of help, which is basically mainly anything to do with the brain. Anything related to the brain, butyrate usually gets good results there. Whether it is, for example,
Autism, ADHD.
Exactly. Or depression.
We have a whole podcast about butyrate, so...
Simply anything related to the brain usually responds very well to butyrate. So it makes sense to start taking butyrate for maybe a month, 2 at most. And in the meantime, try to support the gut microbiome.
Right, I see. Like I was saying, or as you were saying, if the body makes it on its own and we give it to it, it will reduce production a bit. But when the body already has problems like this, it is not a bad idea to try a course of it.
Right, well, in the short term, it won't limit it. You know, if the course is time limited, it just won't have time to get used to it. But if we take it long term, it gets used to having it. And why would it bother?
Right. Well, and so it works the same way with people who use testosterone, for example, right? Then they just don't make it anymore. On the net, right? I saw some. Look, it is some American. He's about 19. He's a terrible, biohacker. But he's not a biohacker. And he basically says everything that contradicts all the, good things we're saying here. And he says everyone should supplement with synthetic testosterone because it is simply the best thing. I am totally saying gosh, but come on. And he is already, his natural one is not being produced anymore. That he has to, inject it already. But I think that since he is young, it is still reversible for him. What do you think?
He is young, 19 now. That should still be able to be reversed. But it will be complicated, of course, because the moment he can start reversing it, the moment he stops taking the synthetic one, which will throw everything in his body completely out of whack. So it is a mess. So it probably wouldn't be completely simple. But since you are talking about hormones, it is very problematic in the case of cortisol. That actually, when a person uses corticoids, which are actually used for various inflammatory problems, corticoids in eczema ointments are just used a lot. And when you just use it, the adrenal glands suppress the production of your own cortisol and...
Wow, the overlap is everywhere.
It is exactly a vicious circle, yeah.
I am just imagining the connection, how the circadian rhythms get disrupted. and a person is completely inclined to depression when I remember what actually happens in the body, what all works and doesn't work then. Okay, that is for another podcast. Could we also say something in connection with weight loss, because that was also mentioned in the article? Is it related to the microbiome?
It is very crucial. It is also related to the microbiome, of course, but mitochondria produce energy. And when you have too few of them or they're dysfunctional, you don't actually produce enough energy. So your energy expenditure decreases. So the moment you want to support that very energy expenditure, you need to support the mitochondria so that you are able to produce more energy.
And that energy causes the fat to be processed, and then we lose weight.
Right. The problem there is insulin resistance, which also quite effectively destroys the mitochondria. So diabetics can have a big problem with weight loss precisely because that insulin resistance destroys the mitochondria, and then they don't produce enough energy. They're unable to absorb the sugar from the blood and convert it into energy.
How could we naturally boost mitochondria? But before we get to that, I have a question for you that is off the script.
Yeah.
Red light is actually widely used to boost mitochondria, fight inflammation, and everything. Like, I've noticed it a lot in the sports world, but also like in beauty, that they shine it on their faces to get better skin. I would like to ask you if you would like to comment on that. If you know anything about it, if you have read anything, do you recommend it? Do you not recommend it?
The effects there are proven, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It is able to support the creation of mitochondria and their function. But if I were to compare it with how physical activity works in this respect, it works much better.
Super.
So if you want to do something for your mitochondria, go for a run. If you run a lot and need to take an extra step, turn on the red light.
Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that people use it when, for example, their ankle hurts or after an injury. Do you have any experience with this?
I don't really have any experience with it. Of course it can work because mitochondria are important for everything. The energy, when it is just not there, the repair processes can also slow down. It is kind of debatable there. Yeah, that.
I understand. I see the red light as like a certain part of the natural light spectrum, right? The red color. And I kind of imagine it that when the sun emits that ray, which is composed of all those wavelengths, from violet through blue, green, yellow, all the way to red, it is actually for the cells on which the light falls some kind of impulse. It is actually energy that somehow kick starts. For example, specifically the mitochondria. But I still wonder if it is okay when none of our ancestors did it. Usually not to the extent that it is recommended now, because, for example, that ad is targeting me. And basically, thanks to the fact that we do these podcasts and I am kind of more interested in it, I am resistant to it. But otherwise, I'd feel like the salvation of my life would be to get a red light panel, and that I'd need to shine it on myself every free moment of my day.
Well, of course, when you need to sell it, you have to make it seem like it is the most important piece of the mosaic of all the little stones, right? So, like I say, it can help, but a normal person would do better to just go for a run.
Thanks so much for debunking that for me. That marketing spiel works terribly well on me. I am not going to get it.
But it really is, the effect is proven. But I am saying if you are simply an extremely trained runner who can't really run much more than that extra step, I think it makes sense there. But just the sports training itself, from the mitochondria's perspective, will do a lot more than this.
Well, I already do a lot of different, processes, and I automate them, and I do this because I do this. I'll have this. I won't have that. Yeah, and adding another factor would just mentally bother me. So I am glad I can move away from this.
Are you looking for a way to support your health and energy comprehensively without unnecessary compromises? Epigenetika has prepared functional packages for you containing carefully selected combinations of 3 products that complement and support each other. Thanks to scientifically proven active ingredients, They work synergistically, meaning their effect is stronger together than separately. Whether you want to support immunity, athletic performance, or longevity and vitality, functional packages from Epigenetika will offer you a comprehensive and well thought out solution based on epigenetics. Each set was created based on expert knowledge and experience in long-term health optimization. You can be sure that every supplement in the package has its purpose and contributes to a specific goal in full quality and to the maximum. What packages has Epigenetika prepared? For example, strong immunity, anti-stress, men's strength, beautiful vitality and longevity, peaceful sleep, menopause in harmony, sport to the max, mental well-being, digestion and microbiome, and several others. Who are the packages suitable for? For everyone who wants to address their health systematically and effectively. For everyone who wants a combination of products that support each other. And for everyone who wants to invest in long-term health, energy and performance. So turn on the right genes and visit Epigenetika.
And so let's jump to how we can naturally kick-start the mitochondria. You just mentioned movement.
I would say that movement is the most important thing of all. Of course, it primarily multiplies the mitochondria in muscle tissue, but the rest of the body kind of goes along for the ride. So, a positive effect on the quantity and function of mitochondria has been proven throughout the entire body. Not all movement is the same. I've already mentioned that if you are shot putting, you don't really need functional mitochondria there, so you won't multiply them by shot putting either, right? The same goes for weightlifting with heavy loads, low reps, because there you are running on those energy systems, on the reserves you already have in those muscles. So you need to do what? Basically, you need the mitochondria for the most. That means some activity that is longer than those 30 seconds, and preferably if it is like shorter, it repeats cyclically in some way. There are two types of training that multiply mitochondria and improve their function. Each one works a little differently, so if you want to maximize it, it is good to combine them somehow. First, it is basically a mild to moderate intensity. Let's say if one of us knows our maximum heart rate, then it is some 65 to 70% of the maximum heart rate. So like a little jog. Yeah, no heavy strain, that thing, as they say in those beginner circles, the conversational pace at which you are able to talk. That multiplies your mitochondria quite well, it improves their function, and it also improves their ability to use fat as fuel. And the second thing is that the other end of the spectrum also works for this very intense activities. That means some intervals, intense ones. Basically, there are like a lot of intense activities that can support this. That Norwegian method popular among endurance athletes, where you actually go at a threshold intensity, that works for this. But really intense things like repeated sprints also work, because when you actually imagine that you are running the 100, then there the ATP is enough for you. But when you take a minute break and go for another 100, in the meantime your ATP and CP had to be replenished, so you could run that next 100. So there you are already placing some demand on the mitochondria. So de facto these very intense activities, whether it is an almost maximum load or that threshold intensity, basically an intensity like VO2 max works well, endurance athletes, no. VO2 max is the maximum oxygen consumption. So basically mitochondria run on oxygen, so they do run even without oxygen. But they mainly run on oxygen. So the moment you are at your VO2 max, then you are actually consuming the maximum oxygen you are capable of. So basically at this intensity, the mitochondria are working at full capacity.
So we've said that what is important for the function of the mitochondria to stimulate them is movement. We've also said, in case the question came up for athletes, that they don't really have to go running, they already run enough. They should include some more intense interval training and what you just mentioned.
Right. It is basically So the combination is really important there, because again, just intensity is also like not a good way to go. So when a person is more like training for endurance, like for endurance disciplines, they need to combine basically some of that so-called volume training, which is the low to medium intensity, more like low with those intense workouts.
Right. And a normal person who maybe doesn't do sports, for them to be created, they should start moving. And you've actually explained that too, that it is simply those runs or walks at a conversational topic. Conversational speed, simply. So I can catch my breath when I am running or walking.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay? And then it can definitely be supported by diet. We've already said that is cruciferous vegetables and also proteins in general, so there is enough of that glycine and cysteine.
It has a harmful effect, but we say that about almost everything. A large amount of carbohydrates with a high glycemic index has a harmful effect. The problem there is that with proteins, they form so-called advanced glycation end products, which damage mitochondria. So a large amount of carbohydrates has the potential to damage the mitochondria, but it depends from person to person. Again, when a person exercises a lot, they can basically afford a larger amount of carbohydrates without it damaging their body in any way. And fasting is beneficial. Well, in general, even like caloric restriction, meaning limiting some caloric intake, and also some fasts, including intermittent fasting, because those fasts effectively activate that autophagy. That is the process we talked about where the cell eats itself. So that is autophagy, and it is the fasts that activate autophagy.
Right? And with this, if your friends would like advice, that is for a consultation with Valka, so you can make an appointment there if needed. And then we also normally recommend some herbs and nutrients, dietary supplements. And I've listed some here based on your article. Of course, I'll name them. Will you comment?
Sure.
So basically, it was mentioned, you mentioned that mitochondria could be supported by sirtuin activators, like resveratrol, for example.
Resveratrol is probably the best known and most potent sirtuin activator. There are more of them, like curcumin is a sirtuin activator, quercetin, there is a whole range of these compounds, but resveratrol is probably the most effective of them. And it is precisely those sirtuins that are necessary for the creation of new mitochondria, primarily sirtuin number 1, to be more precise.
Sure. For anyone interested in sirtuins, we have a whole podcast on it. It is called Sirt Food Diet, or sirtuin diet. You'll find it something like that in our podcast. Butyrate, we've already talked about that. You explained it. So butyrate, vitamin B2.
Vitamin B2 is essential for the functioning of mitochondria, but there is one more important B vitamin, B3. Because from B3, a substance is formed called NADH, which is nicotinamide dinucleotide. And that is basically the substance that directly participates in the processes of energy creation in the mitochondria. So B3 is also essential for mitochondria.
Right, so we can recommend the entire B complex because those vitamins work synergistically. And I also noticed that on the market there is a NAD+ supplement. I think someone has definitely asked about it in one of the Q&As. Does it make sense to take that possibly?
Well, it is that the body actually creates NAD itself.
Yes.
Yeah, so for me, it makes more sense to take B3,
which supports NAD,
from which NAD is formed.
I see. Thanks for the explanation. Then I have coenzyme Q10 written here.
Coenzyme Q10 is again a key thing for the functioning of mitochondria. It has two functions there. First, it is a powerful antioxidant that directly eliminates free radicals inside the mitochondria. And secondly, it is related. Secondly, it acts as a so-called electron carrier. Actually, the principle of oxidation and reduction, which are opposite reactions, is basically the exchange of electrons. Yeah, when you actually oxidize something, you take away from it. I have to think about it now. When you oxidize something, you take electrons from it, and when you reduce something, you give electrons to it.
Okay.
Well, anyway, that was a little chemistry lesson. But basically, oxidation and reduction isn't necessarily a reaction with oxygen, although in the mitochondria it largely is. It is about the exchange of electrons. And the coenzyme Q10 there serves as a carrier for those electrons within those reactions. So without coenzyme Q10, energy production is not possible.
Super.
But coenzyme Q10 again belongs to those substances that it has a lot of good effects. Really, I use it as a kind of pick-me-up when things are at their worst. I just take it for a few days to, kickstart my body again when I am totally out of energy. But when you do it long term, again, the body gets worse.
It is about 2 weeks, a month at most.
Worsens production, well, it probably makes sense when a person is taking some medication. Typically statins, for example, they significantly suppress the production of coenzyme Q10. So there it would probably make sense because there you take that coenzyme Q10 long term. But it means that once you start taking it, you'll really have to keep taking it,
Mm-hmm. Friends, watch out for that. Otherwise, the classic coenzyme Q10 podcast is already out. You can listen to it. You don't have this from an article, but here I am drawing on my own knowledge. So now, friends, we'll see how much I know. Could ECG, epigallocatechin gallate, green tea extract work well positively in some way?
It definitely supports mitochondria too. EKG is also one of the sirtuin activators, so it works that way too.
Super. Then I wrote down bromelain.
That is an enzyme. Bromelain can probably support mitochondria, but I definitely wouldn't name it among the top things.
Okay, and selenium, zinc?
And selenium, I think I mentioned. I mentioned selenium because it supports the production of glutathione. It is itself a part of antioxidant enzymes, so it actually has some antioxidant effects on its own. But at the same time, it supports the production of glutathione. I mentioned astaxanthin, which supports the production of glutathione. Just as a reminder, glutathione is the internal antioxidant that is absolutely essential for protecting the mitochondria. Rhodiola is a sirtuin activator.
That is also useful for those high-altitude training prep camps before a performance, right? And I didn't write down, but I'll ask, what about magnesium? Or is it a total shot in the dark if I said that magnesium might help?
Probably not really directly on the mitochondria. It is, of course, important for energy production, but as for directly activating mitochondria, not really.
Well, magnesium is my favorite supplement. That is why I asked about it. Blani, I don't want to ask anything else, but then, again, have we said everything? Or at least sort of as of today's date and time?
We also left out cold exposure.
Well, we did leave that out. So why is cold exposure good?
Cold exposure causes so-called fat browning, or rather fat beiging. Basically, brown fat is fat that has a lot of mitochondria in it. White fat has very few mitochondria. And mitochondria produce energy. So actually, when our fat turns beige, because for an adult it doesn't really turn brown it doesn't turn brown like infants have brown fat, which actually warms them because little babies don't have shivering thermoregulation. But adults only have remnants of brown fat, but they can make some of their white fat beige, which means that they will form mitochondria, which will then consume or produce energy. And cold hardening is a very effective way to support the creation of mitochondria in the fat tissue. That means it supports the beiging of that fat. Of the dietary supplements we haven't named. Specifically, the beiging of fat is supported by OPC, oligomeric proanthocyanidins. No.
And that complements resveratrol beautifully, which we listed at number 1. So that is that. And otherwise, we talked about this too. It was maybe 10 podcasts ago. I still do cold hardening. It is weaker now in the winter. I don't take any long cold showers after I've bathed in warm water. But hey, except for maybe 4 baths, I always used at least lukewarm water. So apparently I am working on the beiging of fat, and now I vaguely remember that there is 100% an article on cold hardening for this on the EpiVýživa website. There is a guy on it who is getting out of the water on.
Yeah, I remember.
Okay, and anything else besides cold hardening?
I hope we haven't forgotten anything, so I don't have to look at my prep notes.
But I think we've said so much, right? Yeah, we won't make Blanca bend over for the paper here. If you would like to add something or tell us your own experiences, feel free to write to us. We'll be happy to share them in the advice section or in any podcast. Do you enjoy our podcast? Let us know. Because a positive rating on your favorite platform not only makes us happy, but above all, it helps other health enthusiasts find us. And you can do it right now before I finish my favorite sentences here, which I always quote at the end of every podcast. And I am looking at it. Thank you, we already have a lot of those ratings, but it wouldn't hurt at all if some more positive ratings were added. If you would like to try some of the dietary supplements that Blanca and I mentioned, then check out the Epigenic offer, because on the Epigenic eShop or N/CZ with the code GANIPOD you even get a 15% discount. You'll find butter DB complex, resveratrol, XCG, coenzyme, B complex, OP, everything is there. Don't hesitate to try them. You can also try some of the functional packages where suitable combinations are prepared for you, including a synergistic use plan. To date, there are exactly 18 of them. And if I can say so, the synergistic use was created specifically under Blanca's supervision.
If I may mention it, sure, we discussed the individual combinations together.
Epigenic is the first Czech and Slovak brand to focus on epigenetic herbs and nutrients. And they do it with full dedication, honestly based on scientific foundations, with experience and quality in one for a fair price. So, science, experience and quality in one for a fair price. If you need advice on choosing supplements or are dealing with your health, check out our website EpiVýživa and book a consultation with Blanca, because Blanca is great. And she'll be happy to help you. Follow us on Instagram, on Facebook as EpiVýživa so you don't miss anything. And if you want to get a regular dose of news, tips, and biohacks in your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter. We send it every 3 weeks and it is always worth it. Friends, thank you for listening, for making it this far. This is Blanca Pekov-Golubovov signing off.
Bye!
And Petra Eliofov, turn on the right genes for health and longevity.